welcome back to American Cinema. We find ourselves at Lecture 10, the Independent Era. Okay, so let me set the scene. Coming out of the 80s, Hollywood perfects the blockbuster. They have muscle-bound heroes. These films start to not work. People start to not go to them, and they have a couple key flops. One of them be The Last Action Hero, ironically named, because from this point on, Hollywood starts to turn to other types of directors to bring back the audience. Kind of a repeat of what we saw in the late 60s, early 70s. So they turn to independent directors, auteurs, many with names you might recognize, like Quentin Tarantino. And a lot of these young directors are making small, low budget films, putting them in film festivals and getting recognition. Well, Hollywood turns to them, hires them, buys their films, gives them distribution deals, and thus creating what we call the independent era in the early 90s of Hollywood. Now, one of the places they found these directors was an event called Sundance Film Festival. It's a beautiful festival that really came to represent all of the young up and coming directors that have been bubbling up through the 80s. This wasn't something that just started in the 90s. Through the 80s, we have all these young directors that have these great ideas. They're making low budget films, and they get discovered at Sundance, and those directors eventually put Sundance on the map. And now, of course, it's a very famous event where Hollywood goes to shop for young talent. So before we move on to talk about the films, let me set the stage for what's going on in the world. Real quickly, we have the transition from the Bush to Clinton presidency. Clinton comes in, beats George Bush, which had overseen the Gulf War, and which wasn't popular, and also the end of the Soviet Union. The Cold War is finally over, but Clinton is elected, and he's younger, he's vibrant, he's exciting, very charismatic, and what seals his presidency is probably when he goes on Arsenio Hall and plays saxophone and confesses that he might have smoked weed. So this engenders him to the slacker Gen X youth of the day, helps him win the presidency, and it's an example of our media saturated society of the 90s. Much like we have it today, this is the beginning of it. We go to a 24 news cycle, which are covering events in the 90s like the OJ trial, which became huge and famous, the OJ chase, the Michael Jackson trial, and later Clinton's own Monica Lewinsky scandal. These are all plastered across the screens, all these various events that contributed in some ways to the cynicism of Gen X. Gen X is a smaller generation that was raised by baby boomers and other generations, and they were kind of considered the nomad or the lost generation. They kind of turned into the slackers. The slackers generation was a bit of a response to the yuppie generation that were sort of go getter. In the 80s, along comes the slackers, and they want to be artists. They want to be left alone. And they're sort of in between the much bigger boomer generation and the much bigger millennial generation. Okay, so that's a little set for the scene. So we start to see an emergence of a 90s aesthetic here. It's a little bit darker. We can see the films of Tim Burton and um, uh, David Lynch continue into the 90s in their aesthetic. There's a bit of a goth style. They're a little bit more violent, a little bit more sinister, a little bit more cynical. So moving on into the films, we also see the growth of technology and home video. Many more digital cameras. They've gotten a lot cheaper and a lot better now. We see that with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, the first film that I want to talk about. It's a very important film because it kind of creates the mold. It gets exhibited at Sundance, and then it blows up after there. And it's a really frank adult examination of um, sex, relationships, very adult themes talked about in a very mature manner. And it really set the mold, and it set one of the major trends of independent films, which was they were very dialogue heavy. The budgets are low. They can't have special effects. That's what Hollywood's doing in those blockbusters. So instead, they go for character development, character stories, often exploring taboo subjects like sex and relationships. Next up, we have the big one, Pulp Fiction, a masterpiece, a very important film in film history. It kind of changes the game, and it really puts independent filmmaking on the map. Now, it's made with a bigger budget and studio support, but he had control over the film and so forth. For these films to become big and popular, and you know their names, some studio at some point had to jump in. Also, we see the emergence of home video in this time. I want to make sure and mention that. It's been building from the 80s, and now it's just a full-on revenue stream for Hollywood. They have new distribution models. This is really, the 90s is really the heyday of Hollywood in terms of money, because they've got people still going to the theaters, but then they're selling you films, they're renting you films, and then when DVDs kick in the next section, that even jumps it up further. And this is really the heyday. Once streaming kicks in, then Hollywood profits start to decline, and we'll see a lower attendance at the theaters. That's all coming up. Okay, to wrap up the films real quickly. So next we want move on to the player, and I included this one because I wanted to talk about how Hollywood was influenced by the conglomerates, the giant corporations that came in the 80s and even earlier and bought up Hollywood. And they're mainly interested in profit. They're mainly interested in making films that are going to make money. And quality isn't necessarily all that important. And the player really comments on that. It's a satirical film by Robert Altman that takes us inside Hollywood and shows us the backroom deals. And it actually features an incredible amount of cameo performances by Hollywood stars. And then lastly, we have the Coen Brothers classic, Fargo, which was a huge hit, wins an Oscar for writing. Female protagonists, start to see those become more common in the 90s. And it really shows off the underbelly of America with that Coen comedic flair. So it's got crime on the underbelly of America, a little bit like David Lynch or perhaps a film noir, but done in such a blanketed white atmosphere of the far north and that Coen flair for comedy. So all these films are sort of commenting on society. They often dealing with taboo subjects, crime, what's going on behind the scenes. This is the tone of the 90s and the independent era, and sort of the aesthetic and the perspective of Gen X, which was coming of age at this time. All right, hope you enjoyed the lecture. Reach out with any questions. Have a great week.